Today, we are here to talk about international assistance to Syria in general. International aid to Syria has indeed supported the Syrian population over the past years, almost a decade, on multiple levels. However, it has also contributed to creating dangerous patterns on the ground. It has, in a way or another, consolidated war economy, contributed to human rights violations, contributed to empowering certain populations, certain groups of populations over others, and in some cases also to seeding new conflict traps in the Syrian context. Now, in the end of March, on the 31st of March, the Syria Resource Group mobilized a large number of Syrian civic actors to look at this reality of international aid in Syria and to rethink aid interventions in a way that could lead to more integrated and more persistent and consistent policies to Syria in a way that would actually allow the Syrian population to take over the process of shaping their life rather than merely adapting to the conflict realities and conflict dynamics. Now, the conclusions of that convening mainly focused on the need for a new vision. It produced actually a new vision led by Syrian experts on how aid needs to be guided by a human rights-based and sustainable peace conditionality. The vision for more principled international assistance to Syria, as concluded in the convening, requires the political will and the collective action of donors to actually embrace the new innovative approaches and an aid architecture that can shift the response from one adapting to the conflict to one that's actually addressing root causes and the seeds of potential conflict traps. Now, such innovative approaches will entail bridging the silos between the different types of aid and rethinking the linkages between the humanitarian, development, and peace-building aid in Syria in a structural way that would actually allow the Syrian civic space to build efficient governance and efficient governance structures and sustainable local economies on the ground. This session has been organized precisely to advance thinking on this, on the need to break the silos and create the linkages between humanitarian aid, development aid, and peace-building aid in a structural way. I'll start with you, Bassel, if I may. Could you please share with us what sort of programming is needed for such approaches?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Sausan, for the introduction. When we think from a Syrian perspective, and I believe from a international community feasibility, the main concern remains: is this aid enough? Is this aid going to suffice? And how long is it going to sustain people? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is not that straightforward. The aid will always be less than required, and unfortunately, arguably, it can bring more harm than it can do good, especially if it is not well designed and well organized. To overcome this dilemma, the issue of leveraging international assistance into a more sustainable format, recovery and resource generating capacity of the society, that could be a good answer. And especially when we think and we design for the approach taking into consideration the root causes of the crisis. And from today, despite the absence of a peace agreement in Syria, start to invest in addressing the root causes of the crisis, and why not moving a little bit beyond it. To do that, it would require thinking out of the box. From the perspective of the humanitarian work, actually, when we consider development, I mean, the Nexus approach, it's widely used and it is proven quite efficient. Thinking out of the box, that's mean also we need to think in a way that could revisiting who are our partners. Eventually, we might be needing to identify new partners. That means eventually we will be probably needing to look at new institutions and maybe even supporting the creation of new institutions that could sustain this part. It's really revamping the civic power, the civic capacity by looking at them as additional partner to the traditional partners. Thinking also out of the box means we need to remember that no size fits all. That means there is no one approach that we could design today and say, okay, this approach could be applied all over Syria. Syria has various geographies and various realities, and there is various opportunities.
Thank you very, very much. Ryan, would you say Nexus is being implemented in Syria?
Thanks, Selson, and thanks, colleagues, for having me here today. I want to say at the outset that it's very important for me as a UN agency head sitting in Damascus that I'm able to engage with and listen to the voices of all Syrians. So I'm very happy to be here. Maybe just to answer your question, yes, in short, there are things happening in the space of Nexus, and that's what I'm going to try and go through very fast with you today. So excuse me if I run through some slides super fast, but I just want to talk to the points that Bassel was raising briefly around the complex operating environment we're in, and the fact that there are many, many layers to the challenges that we have to assess and look at before we go forward. The Urban Recovery Framework is a global initiative that Habitat's been pushing forward to create an enabling institutional policy framework and related programming to support resilient recovery at scale and the renewal of the social contract. And it aims to address the root causes of conflict and improve urban governance and facilitate the transition to more sustainable post-conflict response. And of course, resilience can be a quite vague and challenging term, but for us, we define it as measures that will be considering absorptive, adaptive, and transformative resilience. So for Syria, we've defined our urban recovery framework around 7 intersecting pillars, which you can see on the slide here. And the point is to guide recovery with considerations to spatial dynamics, multiplier effects, and the importance of phasing interventions in cities. And of course, it's underpinned by analysis that looks at economic, social, cultural, and political landscapes, which have an impact on recovery. We have now in Syria been able to work through the motions of 4 stages from analysis through to monitoring, as you can see on the slide. And I'm going to talk you through that right now. We've managed to test the approach, and we're still in a learning stage. But each time we test something new, we learn something more, and we can do more. So I'm going to walk you through those stages, but I just want to say at the outset that this is all being built up because we're acutely aware of the need to do no harm. So 12 years of humanitarian assistance in Syria. We need a new approach. We need integrated and area-based local pilots underpinned by strong context analysis and capacity of local aid actors to assess risks. We need participatory processes, including the displaced and diaspora. And we need to focus on service delivery systems more completely, and mobility and access, economic recovery and social cohesion, not just applying the traditional humanitarian sectors. And we need to link to wider economic recovery efforts to a likely withdrawal of external funding. And infrastructure and capacity building should be leveraged for creating more civic space, engaging displaced communities, and clarifying issues around tenure security when new programming is happening on the ground. So maybe just to finish off, I mean, we shouldn't be squeezing integrated recovery into humanitarian assistance architecture. We need a new instrument. And funding allocation should be conditional on strong context analysis, participatory planning, and diversified partnerships. And policy analysis, or research, as my colleagues will refer it to in this session, is needed to build evidence and conflict sensitivity. We need to be street smart if we want to do no harm.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan. Max, if I may go to you now, we do need a new instrument. You've been highly involved in the Nexus programming in the context of Myanmar. Could you please share a little bit on your experience on that instrument with us, please?
So the NRM Nexus is is a programming fund that's managed by UN-OPS and funded by the European Union. It's a program which began in January 2020 as part of a wider EU Nexus pilot that was rolled out in a variety of different countries. Although I think what's unique about the Myanmar one is that it is actually a dedicated Nexus fund. So currently the NRM works in all of Myanmar and consists of about 50 million USD in total, and is jointly funded by DG INTPA and DG ECHO. The stated mission of the fund is to contribute to lasting peace and national reconciliation, security, stability, and sustainable development by reducing vulnerability, building resilience, and protecting the rights of communities across Myanmar. Now, ultimately, there's really 4 approaches that this fund has taken in Myanmar. The first component of this NRM approach has been, like every participant has mentioned thus far and will mention again, basing activity design on rigorous evidence, research, and analysis throughout all components of the fund. The second major approach is working to the greatest degree possible through civil society partners, networks, and communities, with the understanding that the only way to truly do sustainable programming is to do it through local civil society, as this is actually going to be something that remains in the country. The third is developing a flexible and responsive approach to emerging needs. So while you're working across the humanitarian development and peace spectrum, you're still responsive to needs as they exist and as they arise. And the fourth is sharing information in order to promote accountability and aid effectiveness, namely because so much of aid responses end up becoming siloed precisely because the different actors don't want to work with each other, do not want to share information with each other for different reasons. So why this has been working in practice, I think, is that there's been 3 kind of components that have made this fund successful in Myanmar. The first is that it's a values-based approach. This values approach grounds the fund in an actual, somewhat tangible objectives. I think a lot of the time, the challenge with Nexus and the Nexus concept is that everyone has a difficult time defining it. It means something different to everybody. Grounding it in a concrete values helps to give the fund some kind of objective. Now for the NRM, that is integration, transformation, and accountability. Integration practically meaning integrating the humanitarian development and peace building streams without creating defined silos in the programming approach. Transformation generally for us means sustainable localization and a heavy civil society focus, with the understanding that local actors are the ones that are going to be remaining as part of this. No development or humanitarian activity is sustainable without local actors leading it. And the third is accountability, meaning, the accountability of the partners to the fund, but also the fund itself being accountable to both communities and to human rights principles. So the real centering of human rights has been the way that the fund has very much oriented itself around many of the political realities of working in Myanmar by grounding everything in that human rights do no harm context. The second kind of component of the success of the fund has been flexibility. And that flexibility in a lot of ways comes from where the fund sits. What is the home of the fund? What is the host of? So in Myanmar, basically a Nexus fund, its home, has to have the flexibility to adopt a wide range of programming modalities across the HDP spectrum, but also has to have the ability to contract and work with a wide range of traditional and non-traditional partner organizations, from CSOs to private sector to whatever. It needs to be able to work across outside of the traditional conception of what is an NGO. Now, in Myanmar, UN-OPS has served this purpose very well because it's a platform-based UN agency that's focused on project management more than on any kind of defined humanitarian or development mandate. So that ability to work across those streams, UN-OPS has worked well in Myanmar. I think there's also a lot to be said about the fact that INTPA and ECHO provide funds into the NRM fund, so that gives that financial and donor-related flexibility to work across different funding streams to allocate funding based on needs and activities. And then I think the third component is this research component that I mentioned. Now in NRM, this comes from the facility that I run, which is the Conflict Analysis and Research Facility. I think other participants have noted this, but to accomplish the nexus, research is critical because you're not just looking at pure needs and needs assessments and humanitarian issues. You're looking at development and political economy dimensions of working in a place. So what the Conflict Analysis and Research Facility does, it's provided by a third party, COAR Global. And so it exists as both a program of the fund, but also a component of the fund that's integrated within program design. So that it allows it to remain independent of the different, components of the response, but also integrated within the fund itself. So this model, which is basically a fund housed within a flexible entity with an integrated research arm and a strong civil society focus, is absolutely something which I think could work in Syria. But the thing that I would emphasize is that the approach and the values that would be inherent in such a fund would need to be something which would be tailored and specific to the Syria context, or really the Syria contexts, because the values of the fund are critical, but they have to be tailored to the country, to the different stakeholders inherent in the fund, and to the fund's donors as well.
Thank you very much, Max. And Fadi, over to you. Is it challenging to define values for a new innovative approach to aid in Syria?
Well, it has been quite challenging, but I think if we keep in mind what is the purpose of what we're trying to do, I think it makes things become much easier. When we talk about nexus, when any kind of mechanism was supporting Syria in a principled way, the way we talked about, first of all, I mean, this kind of mechanism has to keep in mind its key parameter, which is this human right and sustainable peace conditional. And this should be kept in the eyes of everyone at all levels, from the inception to the design to the implementation to the monitoring afterwards. I think this is a key parameter, key value, key pillar for any kind of mechanism, and it's a cross-cutting pillar all around it. I think we can also try to summarize 7 points where we should be, paying good attention. All of them are equally important. None of them is the most valuable pillar. The first of which is this kind of nexus spirit. The nexus spirit in our eyes is not the nexus mechanism that the UN is defending. That's not what we are calling for. We're calling for this kind of spirit where humanitarian assistance, development assistance, and peacekeeping, building up assistance are kind of building together in an overall approach that actually uses the kind of same parameters, and then that actually are supporting each other and not working in silos that are completely, sometimes even contradicting each other on the ground. The second one is, for us Syrians, very important, is our national ownership. This process has to be led by Syrians in a way, but please do not confuse national ownership, which is what is currently being done quite often, which is the government ownership. We have to define mechanisms where Syrians are involved in defining their future, but without relying on the existing de facto powers, including the regime itself. Then we have to move from this kind of overall national ownership that also guarantees that we are preserving the national interest, but also being able to work at a very local level. Why local level? Because we think it's the best level for the time being where we can apply this kind of human rights conditionality and sustainable peace. And working at the local level doesn't mean just supporting local projects. It's actually involving the local community. Working at the local level will also require using kind of trusted Syrian intermediaries. Then we have to make sure in the mechanism that we're in all steps, we are not using compromised channels. We would not want this mechanism to be benefiting any compromised actor. We also would like to see private sector being involved. I think it has been mentioned quite a bit. Private sector in Syria, trusted private sector, not compromise private sector is a pillar. We want to talk about the sustainability of the action that we have. Private sector is going to be a huge contributor to the sustainability of whatever action we are making. The private sector outside of Syria will also lead us to talk about the necessity of having a very dedicated payment mechanism. Syria is a very difficult context. It's a sanctioned context, and it's becoming more and more difficult for all the parties, all the stakeholders, to navigate with this kind of sanctioned and context sensitive situation. And quite a bit of the energy of the whole system is spent on the payment. Unfortunately, it's actually delaying interventions. It's actually complicating interventions. And what we are advocating for here is a dedicated channel that would actually remove the constraints, remove the tension from the financial system, and concentrate it in one area that can be controlled, and actually relieve all the stakeholders, including the international system, financial system, from the burden of actually testing and checking and complying, etc., etc. And the last, and I wouldn't say the most important, but not least important, is monitoring and accountability. We do not want to have a mechanism that actually is focusing, that what we're seeing now, on compliance based on technical issues, financial compliance or donors compliance. We would like to have monitoring integrated in the mechanism that allows to make sure that we are in all steps respecting the human rights and sustainable peace conditionality. We make sure that we are, reaching the objectives of compliance for the donors, but also in securing, and I very much like what Max said, the accountability towards the local population. How we can be transparent, how we can actually involve the local population if we don't have monitoring tools and accountability principles towards these people.
Thank you very much, Fadi, and thanks to all of you for your thoughts and reflections on how we can indeed try to think of mechanisms and practical solutions to shift our way of thinking about international aid to a more sustainable and structural way.